everyone, and welcome to this conference hosted by MS Focus, the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation. I'm your host, Deborah Foreman, the Educational Programs Coordinator for MS Focus, and I'm joined today by Dr. Ben Thrower, who's going to be talking to us about generics versus biosimilars versus bioequivalence, and really, what does it all mean? After his presentation, we'll open it up to your questions and answers. Now, I'm delighted to introduce him. Dr. Ben Thrower is the medical director of the Andrew C. Carlos MS Institute at the Shepherd Center. He previously served as the medical director of the Holy Family MS Center in Spokane, Washington. Dr. Thrower is the senior medical advisor for the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation and enjoys contributing to their quarterly Focus magazine. When Dr. Thrower isn't dressing up as Jack Sparrow the pirate or out on his farm, he can be found playing with his two wonderful grandchildren named Sam and Opal. We're so pleased to have you today to present this important topic, Dr. Thrower, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Deb, and thank you to everyone else at MS Focus for all the wonderful work that you folks do. Thank you to our sponsors for making these programs happen, and thank you to all of our participants for joining in with us. So we're going to talk a little bit about name brand drugs versus generic drugs versus biosimilar drugs. And the reason this is important is as some of our MS medications have some longevity, some of these things are becoming available in generic or biosimilar formulations. We'll talk about some of the good and some of the challenges of, that represents, and then leave plenty of time for questions and hopefully some answers. So what is the name brand drug? So name brand drugs are something that are invented by a pharmaceutical company. They will have a trade name. So they'll, and I'll pick on Tysabri. So Tysabri is the brand name for the molecule natalizumab. These name brand drugs are going to be protected by a patent for a certain number of years. That patent length of time may vary depending upon the drug. If you think back in the early days of MS therapy, some of our original treatments, our interferons, some of those were granted what we call orphan drug status. You know, if a drug fills a niche where there really was nothing before, the FDA may grant it a patent that is longer in years than the usual patent, just because someone put in more time and effort, maybe dollars, in coming up with that drug. At some point, when that patent expires, a generic form of that medication is going to be available. Sometimes generic formulations are available before the patent expires. One of the things that I was not aware of up until a couple of years ago is that there's a whole industry going on behind the scenes of generic manufacturers who hire patent attorneys to look at the patents of name brand drugs and challenge those patents in court. This happens multiple times, every day throughout the US and Canada. So when you look at these patents, if a patent attorney says, you know what, I think your patent is invalid because you didn't state something the right way, or you made a claim that's incorrect, there are millions of dollars going on behind the scenes in these lawsuits trying to overturn patents. What would be an example of that in the MS world? One that happened here in recent years was Tecfidera, our name brand version of dimethyl fumarate. Biogen had the patent on that drug, and it was challenged by a generic manufacturer, and that generic manufacturer won their lawsuit, and the patent was found to be invalid. And so suddenly we had generic forms of Tecfidera available. So when we think about differences between brand name and generic drugs, I think this chart does a nice job of kind of summing up some of the similarities and differences. It's important to note that the active ingredient has to be the same between the name brand and the generic formulation. Frequently, the price on the generic formulation is going to be lower. That's the whole motivation for seeing generics come about. But one of the things that you and I as healthcare consumers are frequently not privy to is there may be backroom deals going on that may affect how much of a cost savings there is with a generic formulation. So certain insurance companies, for instance, may actually prefer the name brand of the drug because they're getting a rebate from that name brand manufacturer that makes it potentially less costly than the generic formulation. You and I are never privy to those kind of deals that are going on behind the scenes. Insurance coverage with brand name medications may vary depending upon what their formulary looks like. A lot of insurance companies use what we call step edits with brand name drugs. This means that, for instance, maybe there's a brand name drug A that we would like to use in multiple sclerosis, but your insurance carrier may require us to try drugs B and C before we can use drug A. That's called a step edit. Those step edits usually don't occur with generic forms of the medications because they're typically less expensive. One of the areas where there can be differences between a brand name drug and a generic drug are with the inactive ingredients. So these might be the preservatives, the fillers, the capsule itself of the medication. Those are allowed to be different between a name brand drug and a generic. Why might that be important? It might be important if you have drug allergies, for instance, to certain dyes or fillers in these medications. And so across generic medications, you'll notice that the generic usually looks a little bit different than the brand name formulation. And that's usually because of the form of the pill that it's in or the fillers that it's in. And where it gets even trickier is there may be multiple generic formulations of a drug. So several different companies may make a generic version of the name brand. Each one of those generic companies may use different inactive ingredients. So again, if you're sensitive to different chemicals, if you know you have dye allergies or allergies to certain fillers, this could be an important differentiation between the name brand and the generic formulation. If you're on a generic drug from your pharmacy and you find one that really works well for you, and the next time you go to pick up that generic, it looks different, you can ask your pharmacy to order a specific generic manufacturer so that if you found a generic that works for you, you can say, well, can I just stick with that one generic so we're not jumping from drug to drug to drug with the generic manufacturers. We're going to talk about another concept in a few minutes that may sort of make another point of why it might be important to stick with one generic versus jumping from across multiple generic formulations. The strength and the dosage. So again, the milligrams of the active ingredient from the brand name to the generic have to be the same. So if you're, for instance, let's say you're looking at, again, to go back to Tecfidera, if you're looking at a 240 milligram capsule of Tecfidera, the name brand, and now you're moving to a generic dimethyl fumarate, it also has to have 240 milligrams of the active ingredient. We're going to talk about a concept called bioequivalence, though, and so even though the milligrams may be the same from name brand to generic, there can be some subtle differences in terms of the pharmacology of that drug. So there is a myth out there that generic drugs are allowed to have differences in the milligrams of the active ingredient. And the numbers that you'll sometimes see thrown out is that generics can have up to 20% less or 25% more of the active ingredient of the name brand drug. And that's not correct. It has to have the same milligram, the amount of active drug, when you go from name brand to generic. Where that 80 to 125% comes in is that the generic is allowed to have some subtle differences in bioequivalence. So what does bioequivalent mean? Bioequivalent means that it's looking at the pharmacokinetic parameters. So a generic drug has to be within 80 to 25% of certain pharmacokinetic parameters compared to the name brand drug. So what are those pharmacokinetic parameters and where are there allowed to be differences from name brand to generic? So the two most commonly measured pharmacokinetic parameters, and I apologize, we're getting a little into some heavy pharmacology, but it's an important concept. The two pharmacokinetic parameters that are allowed to vary from name brand to generic, one would be Cmax. This is the maximum serum concentration. So when I take a drug, the maximum amount that I can measure in my bloodstream is called the Cmax. So a generic form is allowed to have 80% to 125% of that maximum serum concentration. The other way that a generic could differ from the name brand is with something called the area under the curve. So this is the serum concentration measured over time. So this is your total exposure to the drug. Again, the generic form is allowed to have a range of 80 to 125% of the name brand drug of the total area under the curve, or your total exposure to the drug. Does that matter? It probably depends upon the drug. So if we think about drugs where it does matter, it would be a drug with a narrow therapeutic window. So if it's really important that you have a certain serum concentration to get the benefit of a drug, and if you have less than that, you're not going to get the treatment effect. If you have more than that, maybe you're going to have toxicity or side effects from the drug. These parameters could matter. I would say for most generic drugs, it doesn't. But there are examples in the real world where it has mattered. One of the examples I think back over time was with the anticonvulsant Dilantin. Name brand Dilantin was around forever. When the generic formulation of Dilantin or phenytoin came out, we did see some issues with the generic formulation. Dilantin is a drug with a very narrow therapeutic window. If you get a little bit less in your serum, it can mean that you have breakthrough seizures. If you get a little bit too much, it can mean that you're having side effects or toxicity from the drug. And where the generic forms of that drug, of Dilantin, were allowed to have an 80 to 125% wiggle room, in some patients, it did matter. The other potential challenge with that 80 to 125% range with bioequivalence is, let's imagine that your pharmacy gives you a certain generic and that it is 80%, so it's bioequivalent compared to the name brand. So it's 20% less bioequivalent. That can mean that the serum concentration is 20% less, or the area under the curve is 20% less. So you've got one generic form that is a little bit maybe less effective due to that bioequivalence change. And now your pharmacist changes to a different generic formulation that is at the other end of that spectrum. So this one is at the 125% bioequivalent range. So it is maybe 25% higher peak serum concentration, or 25% higher area under the curve. So you're getting more exposure to the drug with this different generic. Well, in theory, that's a 45% swing in bioequivalence when you went to two different generic formulations. So these are examples of ways where generics could be potentially problematic compared to the name brand drug. I will say in the real world, usually that's not the case, but these are things that you just need to have in the back of your mind if you are switching to a generic formulation. So putting that all together, thinking about generics, so a generic drug has to have the same dosage, the same milligrams of the active ingredient as the name brand drug. It could have different inactive ingredients compared to the name brand drug. And there are allowable differences in these pharmacokinetic parameters when you go from name brand to generic. So generic drugs are usually cheaper than their name brand versions. There's some other kind of differences. They cannot be advertised. You'll never see a commercial on television for a generic form. They can't be marketed to healthcare providers. So I'm never going to have a generic pharmaceutical rep show up in my office, trying to give me information about their generic drug. That is not allowed. They can't be sampled. So if your physician is somebody who keeps samples available for you, they typically will only have samples of name brand versions of the drug, not the generic forms. Pharmacies and insurance carriers don't have to ask our permission if they want to switch you from a name brand to a generic version. By law, unless your healthcare provider has stipulated on your prescription name brand only, that pharmacy or the insurance carrier can actually switch you without your permission. A lot of times they will ask your permission just as a courtesy, or they'll send a text or a phone call or an email to me saying, hey, is it okay if we switch Ms. Smith over to this generic form? But by law, they technically don't have to.
Dr. Thoreau, excuse me, could you please minimize the orange box that's on your, because it's preventing people from seeing.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Thank
I
you.
thought we were on the other screen. Let's see if we can. Let's see.
Perfect.
I apologize for that. So we should be getting the other screen, but we'll stick with it the way it is. Now we've got subtitles too.
Which is perfect.
Yeah. So there is another version of generic drugs out there, and these are something called authorized generic drugs. So these are exact copies of the name brand drug, including both active and inactive ingredients. But they're sold without the actual trade name. So this is an interesting little niche, and you're starting to see more of this from big pharmaceutical companies. So they're frequently manufactured and sold by the maker of the name brand drug. They're just trying to break into the kind of the semi-generic realm so that they maybe get better, more favorable coverage from insurance companies. So these may be, again, made by the manufacturer of the name brand drug, or they may sell that license to another company to make that name brand version, but without the name brand. So it's all the same active and inactive ingredients, just without the name brand. They are, again, usually cheaper than the name brand version. So that's kind of an interesting little niche with generics. One other little niche that we see is something called branded generic drugs. So a branded generic drug is a version of the name brand that differs just in some subtle way. Usually it has to do with dosage or the delivery mechanism. So for instance, if there's a drug, a name brand drug out there that comes only in an adult version, someone may say, well, we've done studies and this looks like it works in a pediatric population. So they may come up with a pediatric dose. So this is called a branded generic drug, or they may change the absorption. So they come out with an orally dissolving tablet. That may be a branded generic of the drug. So these do have a trade name and a molecular name. Their pharmacy or insurance carrier is not allowed to substitute a branded generic for the original name brand. They would have to ask the healthcare provider's permission to do that, because there is a subtle difference there. So shifting gears to biologic drugs. So biologics are medications that are in some way derived from a living organism. And in the MS world, the most common class that we would be thinking of would be monoclonal antibodies. So these are going to be Tysabri, Ocrevus, Kesimpta, Rituxan, Lemtrada, all of these types of medications. So when we think of biologic agents, because they're derived from a living organism, these are complex molecules and they are very difficult to copy identically. So when we talk about generics with biologic agents, we actually use the term biosimilar, because there can be subtle differences in the molecule because they are complex. So biosimilar drugs, while they may be subtly different molecularly, they do have to do studies to show that they have the same level of efficacy and safety as the name brand of the drug. Pharmacies and insurance companies cannot automatically switch you from the brand name of a biologic agent to a biosimilar drug. They have to ask for permission from the healthcare provider. So what would some examples of biosimilar drugs in the MS world be? So we use a drug called Rituxan off-label. So Rituxan is the original brand name for rituximab. Rituximab is a monoclonal antibody that works on B cells in a way that's very similar to ocrelizumab or Ocrevus. So rituximab is the molecular name. Rituxan was our original brand name version. Well, now there are two less expensive biosimilar versions. There's Truxima and Ruxience. So here in our area, and it may be true on a national level, if you are working with Kaiser Healthcare for your insurance, well, Kaiser never liked Ocrevus very much. They liked Rituxan. So we could not get Ocrevus FDA approved or get approved for the insurance company for our patients with relapsing remitting MS or primary progressive MS, but Kaiser would pay for Rituxan. Well, then when the first biosimilar came out, Truxima, Kaiser liked that one better because it was a less expensive medicine and the data showed that it seemed to have the same efficacy and safety as Rituxan. Well, now there's another newer biosimilar called Ruxience that's cheaper than the Truxima. So we're having to switch from one biosimilar to the next. I will say when you think about biologic medications, especially monoclonal antibodies, frequently there is some blood test we can do, and especially with B cell therapies, to show that that drug is really doing in the immune system what we want it to do. So when we move from, say, Rituxan to Truxima to Ruxience, we can do blood testing to still show in the immune system that molecule is keeping its mechanism of action. And I'm going to finish up before we go to question and answer with a resource. And some of you may be aware of this already. It's something that has been around for about a year now. And the reason I bring it up is so Cost Plus Drug Company is something that Mark Cuban founded, like I say, about a year ago. And initially there really it didn't seem to impact what we do in MS much. But now some of our MS generics are showing up on Cost Plus. And for some of you, this could be a huge cost savings. So two that I found on there looking here this week. One would be the generic version of Tecfidera. So dimethyl fumarate. So the typical dose of dimethyl fumarate is 240 milligrams twice daily. If you go on Cost Plus, if you look at that 1 month supply, number 60, it's $55. That drug in the name brand formulation is thousands of dollars per month. And here we're talking about $55 per month. Dalfampridine ER is the generic formulation of Ampyra. Ampyra, again, well over $2,000 per month retail cost. The generic formulation here, the standard dose of 10 milligrams twice a day, that's going to be 60 tablets per month, is $20 a month. So I put the website on there. If that is a help to any of you, just know that there are significant cost savings there. Many of you are probably aware and take advantage of things like GoodRx apps on your phone. What we're finding sometimes, as you know, with certain medications, if you look at the copay that some people have on medications, sometimes using these different programs like GoodRx or the Cost Plus Drug Company, for some people, it may be cheaper to pay for the drug outright, out of pocket, versus using your insurance or trying to use copay assistance programs through the manufacturer. So, I think the take-home message is, it's just know the kind of what's going on in the generic world, know about biosimilars, know what some of these resources like Cost Plus are, and try to take advantage of them. Be a smart healthcare consumer. And with that, Deb, I'm going to turn it over to you folks and see what thoughts, questions, concerns people have out there. And if anyone, in the listening audience has had experience with other programs like Cost Plus or any other savings, please feel free to share it. I learn every day from people that we see in the office.
Thank you. I was texting Bhavya, who's doing all the technical, and I'm saying, wow, this is really interesting. It's really interesting. So we are ready for questions. And for those that haven't joined us before, let me tell you that if you are wanting to send in a question, just go into the app and it allows you to send your question anonymously if you choose, or you can do it, and tell us your name, or you can just ask your question live by raising your hand. If you want to do that, then you push the button, press number 9 with the star, and you can do it just by your phone if you're on the phone. And then I'll call on you, and then of course you have to unmute yourself. So let's see, we have a few questions. Josh asked, hello, I'm recently diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and I'm about to start off on Kesimpta and was wondering what it's doing and how to use it.
So Kesimpta is in that class of monoclonal antibodies like Ocrevus and Rituxan. These are all anti-CD20 monoclonal antibodies. So CD20 receptors are present on immature B cells. When B cells grow up, they really have two jobs in our immune system. One is to make antibodies, and the other is to help coordinate the activities of T cells. And so when you have a monoclonal antibody that binds to a CD20 receptor, you're targeting a certain population of B cells for elimination. So you are depleting those B cells. What we would like to see is that this equates then to fewer relapses, no new lesions on MRI, no progression of disability, but also that you tolerate the drug. Anytime we are potentially depleting a population of cells in your immune system, we want to make sure that we're not putting you at risk for infections. One of the ways that we can do that, other than clinically watching you for any increase in infections, is by doing regular laboratory monitoring. So what I would like to see in someone on Kesimpta or any of these other B cell monoclonal antibodies is that you don't have any significant drop in your absolute lymphocyte count, that your T cell subsets are normal, and that your IgG levels are normal. 2 weeks ago, the FDA approved a new addition to this class. So this is called Briumvi, or ublituximab. This is another anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody, and it's kind of exciting. So what does Briumvi potentially bring to the table that we didn't already have with, say, a drug like Ocrevus? And I would say that that's probably the major competition is Ocrevus and Briumvi. They're both every 6-month IV infusions. The Briumvi is going to be about 15% cheaper, and it is a faster infusion. So we'll see where this all shakes out. A lot of times with new drugs, it's going to take a few months for insurance carriers to decide what they want to do with it on formulary, but it's always nice to have more treatment options.
Karen's asking, do you think Kesimpta will ever become available in generic form?
So absolutely. So at some point, the patent will expire on Kesimpta, and then what generic manufacturers are going to have to decide is what's the cost of manufacturing it. What's the market share? Is it worth manufacturing a generic? If the B cell therapy market is getting crowded, or if something new and exciting came out in the future that put a dent in the B cell therapy, use in MS. So yes, the patent will expire. Yes, it should be available in a biosimilar formulation because it's a biologic agent. The question will be: does someone make the financial or the business decision to make that biosimilar form?
I'm not sure if you know this, but Stacy's asking, how soon will Aubagio be available for generic?
really soon. Like within the next few months, it goes off patent.
And someone's asking if biosimilars are the same as regular drugs. Have they been tested?
So the biosimilar does have to show that it has the same efficacy and safety as the parent, the name brand formulation. Yeah, so there is testing on that.
And someone is telling us something really good. They said that they've been buying from Amazon Pharmacy and not only saving more money than using GoodRx, but actually has free fast shipping also. So
Great.
thank you very much, whoever that was that told us. Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Are there any biosimilars coming out for Ocrevus? Judy is asking.
So I don't know when the patent on Ocrevus expires. I don't think it's for another couple of years. So there is no biosimilar right now for Ocrevus. So rituximab is a very, very similar molecule. So again, we do have insurance carriers who prefer rituximab over Ocrevus because it's cheaper and it has the same mechanism of action. And now you have this new drug, the Briumvi or ublituximab, that is name brand only, but from what we're seeing is 15% cheaper than Ocrevus. Same twice a year IV administration.
Nice. Jim's asking, how long, a ballpark, does it take FDA approval on all these generic knockoffs?
So the patent on a typical drug is going to be, somewhere in the, 10-year range or less, unless it's an orphan drug where they sometimes give it longer. So, usually these generic manufacturers, they know exactly when the patents are going to expire on these drugs. So they're gearing up usually behind the scenes to make these generics. And the minute that patent expires, usually you'll see the generics. There's no lag time. They're usually ready to roll pretty quickly. Same with biosimilars.
Nice. Jim said, do you see Tysabri in the shot version infusion to be released in the US? Excuse me, shot versus infusion to be released.
Yeah, so there has been no U.S. testing, to my knowledge, on the subcutaneous version of Tysabri or natalizumab. I think most of those studies are going on in Europe. We'll see. I haven't heard anything from Biogen about how aggressively they want to go after that. There will be a biosimilar version of Tysabri coming out at some point in the foreseeable future because that patent is set to expire. And that's going to be an interesting battle. And this is purely my speculation. I have no insider knowledge of this one way or the other. When you think about what lets us use Tysabri safely, whether we're starting it or monitoring someone's safety over time, it really is that JC virus antibody index testing. If we don't have the ability to do JC virus antibody index testing on a regular basis, we really can't use Tysabri safely. We need to know the status of someone's antibody index. Biogen owns that technology also. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. So let's say there's a biosimilar to Tysabri, but Biogen pays for the JC virus antibody index testing. It's a free test. Is there going to be a charge for people that are on the biosimilar form of natalizumab, whereas the test is free for people on name? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's interesting to speculate what that looks like in the business world, but we've got to have the JC virus antibody index testing to use natalizumab safely.
Somebody said they did hear there was going to be a biosimilar for Tysabri, but they didn't tell us where they heard that. So
yeah, I think that is correct. Yeah, I think that is true.
Okay. So Kate said, this isn't a question, but Gilenya now has a generic. I know the patent was supposed to have expired a few years back, but the generics were caught up in court battle. I haven't seen anything from the MS Society about generic mode and was caught off guard when it arrived from my pharmacy last fall.
It kind of surprised us as well. We had, two situations. We had patients that were just switched to the generic form without, really any permission, or we were suddenly getting letters from insurance carriers saying, can we switch? It's one where if someone's doing great on the name brand form of Gilenya, my preference would be that they probably be able to stay on the name brand form, but I realize also that there may be cost pressures applied that would twist their arm a little bit to go to the generic formulation. I would argue that a drug like fingolimod is one where there probably is a therapeutic window where we don't want too much or too little. I think time is going to tell whether the generic formulations of fingolimod are going to be okay. We've had several patients that have switched over to the generic formulations, and so far I've not seen any issues.
Okay. That's it for questions. If there's anybody that has another question, this is your time to ask. Bobby, I don't know if you have anything in particular that you, oh, excuse me, Karen raised her hand. Let's see. Karen has a question. Let's see. Okay, Karen, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, I did. Can you hear me?
We
Yeah.
can. Do you think that we're close to a methodology, be it blood serum or MRI, that will really tell us whether the drug we were taking is doing any good?
So I think for some drugs, we have, immune markers with blood tests that show us that the drug is doing what it should be doing. Again, the B cell therapies. So if I put you on any of the B cell therapies, I can show you that your CD19 count, which is kind of a surrogate marker of CD20, I can show you that it's 0, and that all of your other immune markers, your T cells and your IgG and your absolute lymphocyte counts, that those are normal. So that is a good surrogate marker immunologically to show that that drug's doing what it should be doing. Ultimately, that's got to translate into a clinical effect. We want to see no relapse, no progression of disability, no new MRI lesions. Some drugs we don't have that. So natalizumab, for instance, that drug is blocking the ability of inflammatory cells to traffic across the blood-brain barrier. I don't have a direct blood test that measures that. That would be wonderful if we did. So I have to look at the clinical effect. If you have someone who has active inflammation on MRI, for instance, they've got enhancing lesions. I know that if I put them on a drug like Tysabri, I should shut that active inflammation down pretty quickly and effectively. So that's an indirect or a surrogate marker to show that Tysabri is doing what it's doing. So yes to your question on some of our drugs, but not on all of our medications.
I understand. Still a puzzle.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you. Okay, so Judy's asking, or rather telling you, that in 2025 through 2026, it'll be interesting to see what the federal government will put on their formulary coverage list due to patients, or patents, forgive me, patents. It will be interesting.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of, I think, that needs to be done legislatively to potentially bring down the cost of drugs. Some of the things we're seeing, letting Medicare bargain like the VA does on the price of drugs. One of the things that happens behind the scenes that I know there's been a push to get rid of legislatively. So when a name brand drug goes off patent and a generic manufacturer steps up to make a cheaper form of that drug, one of the things we've seen in the past is the name brand manufacturer going to that generic manufacturer and saying, you know what, we really don't want you to make that generic. So here's a few $1 million for you to not make that generic drug. Might be good business for the name brand and the generic manufacturer of the drugs. Not great for the healthcare consumer though, because now there's not a cheaper version of that drug out there. I know there's been a push from Congress to do away with that, because you could argue it's kind of monopolizing the market. You could say it's kind of antitrust to do something like that.
Great information. Okay, everybody, this is your last chance. Oops, let's see. We got more. Joyce said, just wanted to say thank you for the info about costplus.com. It'll save her lots of money. And somebody wants to know, what should we be concerned about regarding taking a biosimilar to an MS drug?
So with the biosimilars, and I can't speak across all of medicine, but so far with the biosimilars, and most of our experience has been with the versions of rituximab. I've been pretty happy with them. And so again, I have blood tests with B cell therapies. I can show with your blood test that it is still depleting your B cells, just like the name brand version of the drug was. When we go to the biosimilar of Tysabri, that might be a little bit more challenging because we don't have that direct blood test. But I think, if someone has great MS control, no relapses, no progression, no new MRI lesions, and we switch them to a biosimilar form of Tysabri, we're going to hold it to that same standard. If there's any breakthrough disease that they didn't have previously, I would consider that to be unacceptable.
Okay, everyone, I'll give you another minute. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Dr. Thrower?
I think I really appreciate, again, everything the MS Foundation, MS Focus is doing. We look forward to getting back to in-person programs. Deb and I spoke about that before this started up. So getting closer.
Yep, we do have one more question and then we'll end at that. It says, well, obviously people are saying thank you, but Lori said she's heard of someone taking the generic Empira versus the brand and having success with one and not the other. How could that be if active ingredients are the same? Good question, Lori.
Yeah, so great question. And again, I know it hurts our brains a little bit to think about this bioequivalence, but go back, remember, even though the active ingredients may be the same, generic drugs are allowed to have an 80 to 125% range in bioequivalence. That means the peak plasma concentration, the Cmax, or the total exposure to the drug, the area under the curve, may be 20% less than the name brand or 25% more than the name brand. And if you're switching from one generic to the other, worst case scenario, you may have a generic that is 80% less bioequivalent than the name brand, and you go to another generic that's 125% more bioequivalent. That's a 45% swing in bioequivalence from between generic forms. So I do believe with some generics that translates into a clinical difference, from name brand to generic or generic to generic.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone, for your kind comments. Okay, well, if no one has anything else, then I guess that would bring us to the end of our time. If you missed any part of this conference, it has been recorded and will be available through the MS Focus Facebook and YouTube channels. Oh, wait, one more. Forgive me. May I just get this last one, Doc? I was forced to switch from Empira to the generic. It is not working the same.
So your physician, your healthcare provider, can appeal to your insurance carrier and say, listen, they tried the generic form and it's not working as well. Will you pay for the name brand version of it? Sometimes we win those fights and sometimes we don't, but it's certainly worth the appeal.
So everything we do here at MS Focus is recorded and it's going to be available, as I said, on Facebook and YouTube. Please reply to your registration email for upcoming information on all of our upcoming events. It's really a great way to know what's going on. Also, at the end, and I can't stress the importance of this enough, but we send you a short survey and it takes just a couple seconds to fill out, but it really does give us the ability to know what's important to you, what's meaningful to you in terms of what you're going to listen to. We certainly don't want you coming if it's not something that's going to help you or something you're interested in. So this information is going to tell us from our attendees what to put out there for you, what kind of doctors to get, what kind of information to put out. So please take those 2 seconds to fill that out. We would really appreciate it. Our next teleconference is going to be this coming Thursday, 2 days from today. January 12th at 6:00 p.m. Eastern Time. And our speaker is going to be Dr. Susan Pevrovi. She's going to be discussing food and fasting for MS. When should you eat and when should you not eat? Or what should you not eat? And the interesting thing about Dr. Pevrovi is that she is a doctor. She's actually an anesthesiologist that got MS. I don't know if you're familiar with her, Dr. Thrower, but she got MS many years ago and had to stop being an anesthesiologist. She needed both hands because one of her arms wasn't working. So, and she's turned the whole thing around and really made this work in another way, but also helping MS patients. So she's very interesting. Our sincere thanks to all of our attendees for your participation, and especially to Dr. Thrower. We really appreciate that every month you do this with us and you teach everyone what we need to hear. So good night, everyone. We hope to see you next time, and we'll see you, Dr. Thrower, again. Good night, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks,
Toodaloo.
everyone.